Max, my old friend. Welcome back, buddy. So, today's argument, you'll like this. I actually figured out how debates work this time and all that kind of stuff. So, today's argument, institutional racism is a delusion of the weak and the unskilled. So, before I pass it off to you, I'm going to define each of the words in that sentence. Institutional, meaning there are specific laws, rules, or regulations which disadvantage Black people, which you won't be able to provide evidence for because it doesn't exist. Racism, which, despite its regular definition, the way that people like you use it, it means white people doing things that every other race does, and no one bats an eye. Delusion, meaning it's not real. Weak, meaning people without the will to power, the will to achieve, the desire to do better in life. And unskilled, meaning those without the skill to achieve, those with no merit, those with no talent. Now, the ironic thing is, both will and skill can be developed, but folks on your side of the fence generally choose not to do either and just to leech off the resources of those who do produce. Now, before I pass it over, my final thing is that last time we spoke, oftentimes instead of refuting my facts, you used shaming labels like racist, homophobic. So I've gone ahead and done you a favor. I've written not an argument on this piece of paper so that when you're getting off track, I can bring you back to the topic at hand. That said, it is your turn.
Wonderful. So the first thing I want to start with is by pointing out that your definition of institutional is incorrect. Institutional is defined as of, in, or like an institution or institutions, expressed or organized in the form of institutions. An institution is defined as a society or organization founded for religious, educational, social, or similar purposes. Institution means the society we live in. It's not just the law, but it's how the law is applied. It's the social things. It is the structure that we exist in. And I really want to make sure that we do make this a fact-based debate. So I'm just going to kind of launch right into it. According to a report by the Sentencing Project, a black male is 6 times more likely to go to jail than a white man for the same crime. In spite of being only 12% of the population, black people make up 38% of the prison population. They're twice as likely as whites to be a victim of the threat or the use of force by cops. At the current rate of arrests, 1 out of every 3 black males born today will go to jail in their lifetime. Also, according to the Sentencing Project, these disparities are not caused by the black community being more criminal, but by the, quote, implicit racial association of black Americans with dangerous or aggressive behavior, which, quote, significantly increases police officers' willingness to employ violent or even deadly force against them. According to one study of arrests at a New Jersey turnpike, black people made up 15% of drivers, 42% of stops, and 73% of arrests, in spite of violating traffic laws at almost identical rates. In spite of white people being more likely to be caught carrying guns, drugs, and other contraband, 52% of those stopped by New York's stop and frisk policy were black and 32% were Hispanic, only 9% were white. Studies showed that this disparity remained true when you controlled for the local crime rates and that the actual crime rate of an area was not a predictor of whether an officer would declare it a, quote, high crime area for such a search. The DA of San Francisco found similar disparities in the San Francisco area. A study by the University of California found that the probability of being black, unarmed, and shot by the police is about 3.49 times higher than the probability of being white, unarmed, and shot by police on average. Additionally, the analysis found that there was no relationship between county-level racial bias in police shootings and crime rates, even race-specific crime rates, meaning that the racial bias observed in police shootings in this data set is not explainable as a response to local-level crime rates. An independent analysis of Washington Post data on police killings found that when factoring in threat level, black Americans who are fatally shot by police are, in fact, less likely to be posing an imminent lethal threat to the officers at the moment they are killed than white Americans fatally shot by the police. The report's authors, the only thing that was significant in predicting whether someone shot and killed by police was unarmed was whether or not they were black. Crime variable did not matter in terms of predicting whether the person killed was unarmed. An analysis of the use of lethal force in 2015 by police found no correlation between the level of violent crime in an area and that area's police killing rates. This disputes the idea that the police only kill people when operating under intense conditions and high crime areas, intense conditions in high crime areas. This analysis found that fewer than 1 in 3 black people killed by police in 2016 were suspected of a violent crime or armed. The Department of Justice's investigation into the behavior of the police in Ferguson found that a pattern or practice of unlawful conduct within the Ferguson Police Department that violates the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution and federal statutory law. It found that the department was targeting residents and treating them as revenue streams for the city by striving to continually increase the money brought back through fees and fines. Quote, officers expect and demand compliance even when they lack legal authority. They are inclined to interpret the exercise of free speech rights as unlawful disobedience, innocent movements as physical threats, indications of mental or physical illness as belligerence. African Americans are more than twice white drivers to be searched during vehicle stops, even after controlling for non-race-based variables such as the reason the vehicle stop is initiated, but are found in possession of contraband 26% less often than white drivers, suggesting officers are impermissibly considering race as a factor when determining whether to search. The authors wrote, nearly 90% of documented uses of force by the Ferguson Police Department were used on African Americans, and every documented case of a police canine bite involved African Americans. In Chicago, a 2016 accountability task force found that, quote, black and Hispanic drivers were searched approximately 4 times as often as white drivers, yet the Chicago Police Department's own data showed that contraband was found on white drivers twice as often as black and Hispanic drivers. The police department's own data, the report found, gives validity to the widely held belief that the police have no regard for the sanctity of life when it comes to people of color. A 2014 analysis of Illinois Department of Transportation data by the American Civil Liberties Union found the following, quote, African American and Latino drivers are nearly twice as likely as white drivers to be asked during routine traffic stops for consent to have their cars searched. Yet white motorists are 49% more likely than African American motorists to have contraband discovered during a consent search by law enforcement, and 56% more likely when compared to Latinos. A study by the Center for Policing Equity found that African Americans are far more likely than whites and other groups to be the victims of the use of force by the police, even when racial disparities in crime are taken into account. A 2010 governor's task force examining police-on-police shootings found that even black and Latino police officers face a greater risk of being killed by the police. In cases of mistaken identity, 9 out of 10 off-duty officers killed by other officers in the United States since 1982 were either black or Latino. Quote, inheritors of conscious racial bias play a role in shoot-don't-shoot decision made by officers of all races and ethnicities, the report found. A Stanford study of police practices in Oakland, California found that officers were disproportionately handcuffing blacks. Quote, regardless of the area of the city, disproportionate treatment by race was similar, and the raw totals were stunning, according to a Washington Post summary of the findings. The Post continues, 2,890 African Americans were handcuffed but not arrested in the 13-month period, while only 193 whites were cuffed. When Oakland officers pulled a vehicle over and didn't arrest anyone, 72 white people were handcuffed, while 1,466 African Americans were handcuffed. The researchers also found significant differences in the way officers spoke to African Americans. Using only words on an officer used during a traffic stop, we can predict whether that officer is talking to a black person or a white person with 66% accuracy. A black on white murder is twice as likely to receive a death penalty as a white on black murder. Prosecutors are significantly more likely to upgrade cases to felony murder status in cases in which the defendants are black rather than white. In 2012, a study in Louisiana followed a trend of studies and reports demonstrating that black jurors are struck down at rates of 2 or 3 times those of their white peers. Some estimates suggest that qualified black jurors are turned away at rates as high as 80% of the time in some parts of the country. 25% of jurors in death penalty cases have no black members of all, 70% have 2 or less. When a black person is accused of killing a white person, jurors with 5 or more white males are considerably more likely to convict and hand down a death penalty than they otherwise would be. Having even 1 black male in the jury reduces that chance significantly. According to Wall Street Journal, black people are sentenced to prison terms which are 20% longer than white people for the same crimes. For the same crime with the same severity, black people are 38% more likely to be sentenced to death. Killing black people in America leads to less severe punishment than killing white people. White and black people each make up about half of murder victims each year, but 77% of people executed killed a white person, while only 13% killed a black person. The so-called war on drugs has had a devastating and disproportionate impact on the black community. Only about 13% of drug users are black, about the same as their share of the overall population, but they account for 36% of those arrested and 46% of those convicted for drug-related offenses. In spite of crack and powder cocaine being equally addicted and, quote, pharmacologically identical, you needed 100 times more powder cocaine to receive the same sentence as someone possessing crack cocaine until Obama passed the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010. That disparity is still a baffling 18-to-1. Black people make up 80% of crack users, but only 28% of powder cocaine users, and this disparity in sentencing has had an impact on the black community. Black children are not safe from society's racism either. According to the APA, black children are 18 times more likely to be sentenced as adults than white children and make up 58% of children admitted into prison. After the age of 10, black children are dehumanized and considered less innocent compared to other children of the same age. Black juvenile offenders are considerably more likely to be viewed as adults than white counterparts. Black children are 3 times more likely than white children to be suspended. Even among preschoolers, of whom black kids make up 18% of the population, they are nearly half of all school suspensions. Black students make up 39% of all expulsions, and over 70% of students referred to the police are either black or Hispanic. Even disabled children are not free from racism. 21% of students with disabilities are black, but black students who are disabled make up 44% of disabled students put in mechanical constraints and 42% of those placed in seclusion. Black college graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed as college graduates overall, and the jobless rates for black people have almost doubled that of white people for the last 60 years. And people with black-sounding names need to send 50% more job applications than people with white-sounding names to get a callback. Racial discrimination in hiring is so pronounced that a white applicant with a criminal record is more likely to get an interview with a black man with a clean record. Studies show that for every $10,000 increase in yearly salary between the jobs, the share of black people holding that job falls by 7%. Given the unequal opportunity, it's unsurprising that the black people are in such severe poverty. Infant mortality rates are higher among the black community than the white community, and that gap has been growing steadily. 72.9% of white folks own homes compared to only 43.5% of black folks. White median household wealth is just over $91,000. Black median household wealth is about $6,000. This gap has tripled in the last 25 years. If Black America was its own country, it would have wealth levels at the same place as Morocco and the Dominican Republic, and be about a fifth of the global average. The numbers are clear. America mistreats black people both in and out of the criminal justice system. It is a place where the police apply the law more harshly on black suspects than white ones. It is a place where black people are treated from preschool as victims of the system and taught they are lesser citizens as compared to white people. The statistical evidence is what it is. The numbers are out there. And my opponent will try and pin responsibility for these disparities, no doubt, on the black community itself, on their higher crime rates and so on. But many of the studies I described explicitly controlled for those variables other than race. Many of the police ones found the disparities exist even in cases when white people are more likely to be committing a crime. Not to mention how absurd it is to use that argument when talking about disabled children. The facts are what they are, and the time has come for the people who are ethically conscious to stand with our brothers and sisters in America who are victimized by the racist system in which we live. I'm now going to copy and paste all of my links and studies into the comments section for the review of viewers. By the way, I liked the Egyptian hat. I thought it went well with the rest of your deal. All right, your turn.
So you completely ruined the integrity of this debate by taking more than 11 minutes to rattle off statistics from dozens of different sources on dozens of different topics without ever stopping to actually debate a single point. It seems, and you couldn't do this last time too, you have these little like strategies that try to defend my arguments without actually making a fair debate. So what I'm going to ask you is, why don't you pick one of the 2 to 3 dozen topics you just rattled off endlessly, and we'll actually debate them, rather than you listing all of your sources, half of which you may have made up. I heard you talk about the Washington Post as well. I'm sure most of them are bullshit, and a lot of the statistics you mentioned are specifically opposed to federal statistics like the FBI's Unified Crime Report and like the National Crime Victimization Survey. So why don't you pick one of the detentions, drugs, or crime? Let me know which one you'd like to debate fairly, and then we'll see if we can do this like adults this time.
What's not adult about it? It's tough because like you're telling me to narrow this down to like facet of institutional racism, but like institutional racism is part of the institution at large, and I think you know, okay. I don't know, I'm pretty open-minded. Which of those things do you think is wrong?
Well, your statistics about being, suspended more often because of racism is obviously untrue. So why don't we talk about that one for a little while? The reason blacks are suspended more often is because they misbehave more often. There are accounts, as you can see, Colin Flaherty has documented this at length, both on his YouTube channel and in his books. There have been countless surveys of teachers who said the exact same thing in this regard. It's because they're loud, they're violent, they flip their desks when they're mad. Not all the time, of course, but oftentimes. They engage in wildly inappropriate and borderline criminal behavior, oftentimes criminal behavior itself, and that's why they're suspended more often. It has nothing to do with the color of their skin. Yeah, why don't we start with that one?
Is that also true for the disabled children who are restrained and sent to seclusion? Much higher rates in spite of making up such a minority of disabled children and those things. Do you also believe that's true of disabled youth?
People who engage in disproportionately inappropriate behavior get disproportionate consequences. In fact, one of your arguments, I think in there, I kind of nodded in and out over your 11-minute tirade. I'm pretty sure you mentioned that blacks were in prison disproportionately compared to the crime rate. And you're right about that, but not in the direction that you think. Compared to the amount of crime they're actually committing, specifically the violent crime and the murder, they're actually in prison disproportionately small compared to how they should be in prison. And the reason for it, and then you, at the end of your little speech there, you mentioned, oh, he'll blame these problems on the black community. And there's a reason. It's because there is such a thing as accountability. And people like you peddle your what's called the soft racism or the soft bigotry of low expectations, where you believe that no matter how horrible people are acting, if they're black, you don't apply these standards to any other race besides blacks. You believe that no matter how horrible they're acting, they should be treated with the utmost respect and not held to the same standard as everyone else. That's exactly the kind of attitude that leads to affirmative action, which specifically advantages black people at the expense of everyone else, which I noticed you failed to mention, because all that you did was mention things that you thought were unfair to blacks, and completely failed to mention any of the ways in which this country benefits them to an absurd degree over everyone else, not just in this country, but this country benefits blacks more than any other nation on earth. And I noticed you failed to mention that as well.
Oh, well, it's not a competition, right? Like, we don't treat you as bad as the other guy. It's not really a defense. But I'm going to go ahead and read you a few, just because you say you nodded out a few times. So here's a few quotes, just two, so it's not too bad. The only thing that was significant in predicting whether someone shot and killed by police was unarmed was whether or not they were black. Crime variables did not matter in terms of predicting whether the person killed was unarmed. Here's another quote. The racial bias observed in police shootings in this data set is not explainable by local level crime rates. Let's see. Threat. All right. There's another really good one, but I'll find it in between your things. So again, can you explain to me why in the cases that I listed, and there were many of them, where even when the crime rates are equal, even when we control for the crime rates, even in cases where white people were more likely to be breaking the law, black people are still treated as worse? I listed multiple examples. What's your explanation?
Sure. Well, first of all, the idea that more blacks are shot by cops than whites is blatantly false. Almost twice as many whites are shot by cops as blacks. A second reason why blacks are more punished for what you call the same crimes is because, of course, you're not taking into account the past history of crime, in which case, oftentimes, the blacks have a long list of felonies that a white arrested superficially for the same crime does not have. And, of course, judges do take into account history of criminality when determining a sentence. The last reason, if we were to assume that what you're saying is true, cops are more trigger-happy around blacks, is because blacks are far more likely to attack cops, specifically cops white. According to the national data, 85% of all violence between blacks and whites is perpetrated by blacks against whites. So once again, if the cops are more wary, you could say, around blacks, which reasonably they would be, it's again because they're afraid of being hurt by the demographic most likely.
Okay. When factoring in threat level, black Americans who are fatally shot by the police are in fact less likely to be posing an imminent lethal threat to the officers at the moment they are killed than white Americans fatally shot by the police. The only thing that was significant in predicting whether someone shot and killed by the police was unarmed was whether or not they were black. Crime variables, all of the things you're listing, how threatening they are, what their background is, overall crime rates, those are all crime variables. Crime variables did not matter in terms of predicting whether the person killed was unarmed. The only thing that was significant in predicting whether someone shot and killed by the police was unarmed was whether or not they are black. I'm posting studies. I posted links to these studies. These things are statistical facts. And this whole, well, more white people are shot than blacks. There are way more white people than black people. The percentage of people in this country that are black is in like teens. If they're, let's just stay for a minute. These numbers are wrong. But if there are 50 people killed by police in the town, and 25 are black and 25 are white, but there are twice as many white people as black people, then black people are getting shot at a twice as high rate. This is basic statistics. So I guess I'm not really sure why you keep repeating that it's due to crime variables after I have cited studies proving you wrong. I'm hoping you come back with something that hasn't already been disproven in my opening statement.
Well, first of all, what you're saying is just blatantly false. This is part of the whole false narrative of the Trayvon Martin thing and the Michael Brown and all the other martyrs of the Black Lives Matter movement. Across the board, all of whom turned out to be either lying or the people around them were lying. They were armed, and media reported them as people like you ran with the narrative, oh, they were unarmed and innocent, even when video evidence showed that was clearly not the case, or they were committing a felony that was running from police, running towards them with a weapon, running away, failing to follow in Michael Brown's case, actually assaulting the police. And then it was reported that the person was unarmed, innocent, and didn't do nothing wrong. So I'd be curious whether the people in your studies actually went with the truth or the false narrative that the entire leftist media was promoting. Second of all, you're absolutely right. There are way more white people than blacks. And yet, from 1976 to 2005, blacks still managed to commit 52% of the murder. Now, let's go down a little bit. It's not black women doing this, it's black men. Now we have 7% of the population committing murder than the remaining 93% combined. And you're going to sit there and tell me there's no reason might be in jail disproportionately, why cops might be more wary about them, despite the fact that they're represented in the most vile crimes in the country.
Whether or not rates are higher among the black community, and they are, has nothing to do with whether or not the institution discriminates against them. When you use terms like cops have a right to be a little leery, that leeriness around black people is racism. So I guess, and here's another thing, is I feel like kind of the core of your argument, correct me if I'm wrong, is that all of these studies and the Department of Justice's numbers and all these statistics are wrong because you saw a video where a black guy ran away from a cop. Is that more or less your argument?
No, it's not video. Well, part of it is dash cam, body cam footage. In Michael Brown's case, of course, he was caught on camera robbing someone moments before he ended up getting shot. Now, again, you can sit there and say it's racist to be weary of the person most likely to attack you, but meanwhile, people with common sense would also call that common sense. Now, I want to go back to a point I mentioned earlier that you completely failed to address, which was you're focusing entirely on all these ways in which you and the leftist sources you've quoted believe that blacks are being discriminated against. You completely failed to address or mention in any way any of the ways in which blacks are institutionally advantaged, or the ways in which America uplifts, spends trillions of dollars, busing to nicer schools, building nicer schools in their communities, bending over backwards to elevate blacks much more than any other race. This helps them. You've completely failed to mention all the ways that institutional discrimination or racism, what you're calling it, benefits the black community. Why have you chosen to ignore all of the things the country does specifically for black people, often at the expense of whites and Asians?
Well, first you tell me that I'm saying too many things and too broad and down, and now you're complaining that I'm not talking about enough things. It's really tough to keep up, although I did find your not a video, but dash cam footage, body cam footage, and a video response to be extremely humorous. However, when you have schools funded by local property values, and which then you have situations where schools in poorer neighborhoods are worse than schools in richer neighborhoods. When you have a situation where one ethnicity, in particular black people, are more likely to live in poorer neighborhoods, they have worse schools right off the bat. paying a bunch of money to make the bad schools you've allocated for a group of people better is not like schools in low-income areas are still worse. You know, that said, regardless of whatever it is we're doing to try and patch it up, we have to acknowledge the problems which are proven by the statistics that I quoted. And again, kind of to rebut your whole thing, I quoted a bunch of statistics from sources like the Department of Justice, which you appear to believe is a liberal blog. And then you responded by saying that you'd seen videos. And then I said, videos? And you said, no, not videos, videos. And so I want to come back to, what do you have that is better than my statistics for believing what it is you believe? And if you don't have the kind of evidence that I do, why is it so emotionally important to you to believe that these statistics are false, that you are willing to overlook them in favor of a video that you saw on a body camera one time?
I also quoted from the Unified Crime Report from the FBI, from the National Crime Victimization Survey, but of course you skipped over all that. Now, you're mentioning the Department of Justice is very interesting. Obviously, if you're paying attention at all, the Department of Justice has been nothing but a propaganda wing of a very specific narrative. And in fact, the people like the, what's that woman's name, Mosby in Baltimore, the people that the Department of Justice propped up as these pillars of virtue during the Black Lives Matter riots are now being sued by the police department successfully because they coordinated with the Department of Justice to throw these cops under the bus in favor of a completely false narrative. So if you're arguing that the Department of Justice is somehow this nonpartisan, completely objective group, they're obviously not. And nothing that's come out around this Black Lives Matter movement, the whole idea of which was that these martyrs, the Freddie Grays, the Michael Browns, they were innocent and didn't do nothing. That's a lie. It's not true. And the people defending it, all the black people in government defending it, were liars. And they were displaying tribal in-group favor when they're reporting to people like you and these sources that you're reading, when they're saying, oh, they were innocent. It's called lying, Max.
Okay, so again, I didn't say the objective source, but you called all of my sources, you know, these left-wing, blah, 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 right? And the things you said about leftists attacking the Department of Justice proves your assertion that my sources are leftist wrong. Because why would we cannibalize a left-wing propaganda machine? And let me go ahead, and you specifically brought up Michael Brown, and my Department of Justice reference was in response to the investigation of the police in Ferguson with the Michael Brown shooting. And I'm going to go ahead and quote that again. The Department of Justice's investigation of the behavior of the police in Ferguson found, quote, a pattern or practice of unlawful conduct within the Ferguson Police Department that violates the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution and federal statutory law. It found the department was targeting black residents and treating them as revenue streams for the city by striving to continually increase the money brought in through fees and fines. Officers expect and demand compliance even when they lacked legal authority. They are inclined to interpret the exercise of free speech rights as unlawful disobedience, innocent movements as physical threats, indication of mental physical illness as belligerence. African Americans are more than twice as likely as white drivers to be searched during vehicle stops, even after controlling for race-based variables, such as the reason the vehicle stop was initiated. So that means not because they were doing anything. They control for other variables. And that's an important scientific phraseology that you should look up if you don't know it. Such as the reason the vehicle stop was initiated, but are found in possession of contraband 26% less often than white drivers, suggesting officers are impermissibly considering race as a factor when determining whether to search. Nearly 90% of documented uses of force by the Ferguson Police Department were used on African Americans, and every documented use of a police canine bite involved African Americans. So, math.
Okay, again, you keep pointing out statistics like 90% of the time force was used, it was against African Americans, while utterly neglecting the fact that those are the people committing the violent crime by an overwhelming margin. You know, people like you say that stop and frisk or this thing you just described are somehow racist, and yet it drops the crime rate, again, by an enormous margin, because those are the people committing the crime. In fact, I have a statistic right here. According to the New York Police Department in 2014, and by the way, I know you like to say I'm a white supremacist, but I'm really not. This is just objective fact. If New York were an all-white city, the shooting rate would drop by 97%, the murder rate would drop by 91%, and the robbery would drop by 88%. Now, blacks and Hispanics together are the ones committing the vast majority of these crimes. That's why cops are what you call profiling. It's called common sense, and it's called using statistics to determine who you're going to look at most carefully. But again, I want to get back to the point that you keep avoiding. You keep arguing that this country is discriminatory against African Americans by mentioning the collusion between the Department of Justice, the media, and local police departments in places like Ferguson, which has all been well documented by Colin Flaherty, specifically in his book, Don't Make the Black Kids Angry, which is an amazing book, which you should read, you really should. You'll see how the media and the police departments and the federal government work together to excuse, deny, and defend black crime goes on. What the media shows is not remotely representative of what's really going on, but the cops all know. But again, the point you keep avoiding, why don't you look at any of the ways that this country trends over backwards to fit African Americans? That disproves your whole theory that they're all being discriminated against. When the cops go after them, it's because of the crime rates, and you're just ignoring all the benefits. Why is that?
So first, I want to say higher crime rates, regardless of how high or low the crime rates are in the black community relative to the white community, if we control for those other variables, as I've demonstrated statistically, we find that there is a discrimination against black people. And you mentioned New York, and here's the study. I quoted this already, but I'm going to go ahead and quote it to you again. The disparity in the stop and frisk application remained true when you controlled for local crime rates. That the actual crime rate of an area was not a predictor of whether an officer could declare it a high crime area for such a search. What that means is they were not searching if a white person was in a high crime area where they were more likely, by being in that area, to be committed crime. They are still less likely to be searched, of equal likelihood to be searched as a white person compared to a black person in a low crime rate area. The things you are saying are the motivations, are things I have proven are not the motivations. As for the help that the United
Okay, see, this is the problem with spending the first 11 minutes rattling off statistics, is now you get cut off at the end. So what you're saying is not the motivation. You can say that, you can quote your Washington Post and say it was all controlled for, but you're still wrong. When you look at, if stop and frisk was a tree, the fruits of that tree were that crime rate dropped dramatically. Again, I keep trying to explain this to you, Max. The blacks and Hispanics in New York are the ones committing most of the violent crime, despite the fact that they are minorities. So unlike you, I'm not going to take the next 7.5 minutes to rattle things off here. I wish that you would have taken a tenth of the time in your original statement so that we could talk about, for example, the fact that Princeton just did a study of this. When black people take the SAT compared to Asians, Asians get 50 points knocked off their score automatically, and blacks get an automatic 230-point boost to their SAT just for being black. And in fact, the entire Asian community is very upset about this because these are people with the merit, the will, and the skill to achieve, and they're being specifically held back from the colleges they deserve to go to, so that black people without the merit, the will, and the skill, not that all black people don't have that, obviously there are a lot of smart black people out there, but the ones without the will, the skill, and the merit are taking their place in institutions, despite the fact that a lot of these people can't even read or write at what I would call a 6th grade level, because this country bends over backwards to elevate blacks into everything, into government positions, into management positions, into colleges they don't deserve to be in. And one of the other things you mentioned in the very beginning was that whites are more likely hired than blacks based on name. Now, you say that's because of discrimination. The real reason is because hiring black people has become very problematic, because even if they're acting really, really bad, even if they're bad employees, you can't fire them without the risk of being sued for racism. And I'm sure you're not an entrepreneur. I'm sure you don't actually own a business, because then you would understand that when you're dealing with these things, when you're thinking about employees, these are considerations that you have to take into account. You can't hire someone who's a high risk unless you're absolutely sure they're great for the job. And if some resume comes in with a clearly African name, You have to take it into consideration. It has nothing to do with racism. It's covering your own ass and making sure that you don't get sued, because people like you will defend them and say that their firing was racist, even if they were stealing from the warehouse, even if they were doing a terrible job. So I don't think you've proven discrimination at all. You've used statistics from a DOJ that's colluding with police departments to lie, which is why, like I mentioned, Mosby is now getting sued by the police department. And you've said things that are blatantly untrue and completely failed to mention, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, completely failed to mention any of the ways blacks are benefited by being in this country. There is no country in the history of planet Earth that has treated black people as well as America does. There's no country with more black millionaires, no other country with all these black celebrities, no other white country with a black president and a black caucus. We bend over backwards for them. And the problems they have with police are because of